The feeling starts somewhere you cannot point to. Then glands above your eyes begin releasing fluid, your face changes, your breathing loses its smooth rhythm, and an emotion that was private becomes visible. That transformation feels immediate, but it is not one reflex. Crying is a coordinated event involving the tear system, facial muscles, breathing, the voice, and both branches of the autonomic nervous system. Scientists can map many of those parts. The mystery is how the brain binds them into the experience you recognize as a cry. So, is the story, your eyes are already covered in tears. Every blink spreads a thin tear film across the cornea. That film keeps the surface wet and smooth, helps focus light, and protects the eye from irritants and infection. Most of the time, the system is so quiet that you never notice it. The fluid does not come from a single tap. The lacrimal gland above the outer part of each eye supplies most of the watery portion. The film also includes mucus that helps it cling to the surface and an outer oil layer that slows a drop of salt water. It is the visible overflow from a carefully maintained surface. That matters because emotional crying does not invent a new liquid delivery system. It takes control of machinery that is already working. Are tears from grief completely different from tears caused by an onion? Not in the simple way that claim is often repeated. Reflex tears and emotional tears are both released mainly by the lacrimal glands. The fluid from those glands is predominantly water, electrolytes, and proteins. What clearly differs is the input that orders the release. When an irritant reaches the surface of the eye, sensory nerves in the cornea and conjunctiva send an alarm through the trigeminal system. That signal is processed in the brainstem and returned through parasympathetic fibers associated with the facial nerve. The gland responds by secreting fluid that can wash the irritant away. Researchers call this the trigeminal parasympathetic reflex. Emotional crying reaches the same gland from another direction. Networks involved in emotion and autonomic control can influence the brainstem cells that regulate lacrimal output without an irritant touching the eye. The final route overlaps with reflex tearing, but the initiating information came from inside the nervous system rather than from the ocular surface. That is the central trick. An event represented in the brain becomes a physical secretion at the eye. It also explains why a tear cannot reveal its own cause. The final gland and much of the outgoing route can be shared even when the initiating event is completely different. Irritation at the cornea, separation, loss, a wedding, or a piece of music, by the time the order reaches the lacrimal apparatus, each has been translated into secretion. Think of the system as two conversations joining the same final line. In reflex tearing, the message travels inward from the surface of the eye, is processed in the brainstem, and returns outward to the gland. In emotional tearing, activity from higher networks enters the control system from above and recruits that outward path. The visible result is similar, but the nervous system arrived there by a different entrance. This is also why the popular question, "Which brain part makes you cry?" has no neat answer. A gland can explain the fluid. A motor pathway can explain a facial contraction. A vocal circuit can explain a sob. None of those alone explains why a particular memory recruited all of them together. The behavior belongs to the coordination, not to one component. How does that signal reach the gland? The route is surprisingly long. Parasympathetic fibers begin in a lacrimal region within the brainstem. They travel with the facial nerve, separate into the greater petrosal nerve, and reach a relay called the pterygopalatine ganglion. From there, postganglionic fibers continue toward the lacrimal gland. Neuronal stimulation activates contractile cells around the gland's secretory units, helping expel fluid through small ducts onto the eye. The tears are not waiting in a tank for an emotional valve to open. The lacrimal system produces the surge. Research reviews note that there is no stored pool of tears ready to be dumped instantly. Neural input drives secretion, and stronger input produces on your cheek. Under ordinary conditions, blinking spreads the film and guides used fluid toward tiny openings at the inner corners of the eyelids. From there, tears pass through narrow canaliculi into the lacrimal sac, then down the nasolacrimal duct and into the nose. Tear production and tear drainage normally stay close enough to balance that the whole circuit remains invisible. During a strong cry, secretion can outrun that route. The extra fluid pools along the lower eyelid and crosses its edge. Gravity takes over, and the tear becomes a track on the face. The same plumbing explains why your nose starts running. Some of the larger flows still enters the normal drainage pathway. The nasolacrimal duct delivers it into the nasal cavity, so the liquid at your nose is partly the eye's overflow arriving through its usual exit. But tears are only one part of crying. What happens to the rest of your face? Emotional crying recruits several muscles across the face. The expression is not produced by the lacrimal gland. Motor networks activate facial muscles while autonomic pathways drive secretion, making them coordinated but distinct components of the cry. The voice is another system again. Cry vocalization involves laryngeal activity, respiratory movements, and the muscles that shape sound above the larynx. The periaqueductal gray in the midbrain is strongly implicated in organizing nonverbal vocal patterns, coordinating the oral, facial, laryngeal, and breathing muscles. Much of the detailed circuit evidence comes from animal work and observations of neurological patients, so researchers are careful about sound. That caution matters. Crying looks like one behavior, but the brain may be assembling several outputs at once: visible tears, a facial display, altered breathing, vocal sound, autonomic arousal, and the subjective emotion itself. A single switch would be simpler. The evidence points to coordination across a network. Which side of the autonomic nervous system is in charge? Tear secretion is predominantly parasympathetic. That sounds like a contradiction because emotional crying can feel highly arousing, while the parasympathetic system is often summarized as the body's quiet, restorative branch. The contradiction disappears when you stop treating the two autonomic branches as an on-off pair. Emotional crying can involve sympathetic and parasympathetic activity together. Studies have associated crying with increased sympathetic activity, including changes in heart rate and skin conductance. In one laboratory study, heart rate rose and then subsided after crying began, while breathing slowed and respiratory sinus arrhythmia increased. Reviews find a reasonably consistent sympathetic rise around crying, but the parasympathetic pattern is more mixed. So a cry is not simply the body calming down, and it is not simply the body escalating. It can contain arousal and recovery in sequence, with different components running on different clocks. Does that mean crying makes you feel better? Not automatically. The familiar catharsis story says tears release pressure and leave the crier relieved. Yet published reviews describe the empirical support for a universal catharsis establish relief as the automatic result of producing tears. One clue is that the effect of crying may not stop at the boundary of the body. In experiments, researchers compared ratings of tearful photographs with versions in which the tears had been digitally removed. The visible tears increased reported willingness to help the person in the image. The effect was linked especially to perceiving the person as helpless. That finding has limits. A laboratory rating is an intention, not an act of help, and the researchers themselves call for more naturalistic tests. But the result supports an important possibility: the tear on the cheek changes what another nervous system sees. Other experiments find that adding visible tears makes faces look sadder even when the underlying muscle expression is unchanged. Tears therefore carry information on top of the face. They do not announce the exact cause. They tell an observer that the emotional state matters. That may explain why emotional tears appear in joy as well as grief. Adults cry at losses and separations, but also at weddings, music, and the birth of a child. The examples suggest that the visible signal is not tied to one emotional label. Are humans the only animals that do this? The exact claim needs careful wording. The young of most other mammals and birds make distress calls. The production of visible emotional tears, however, appears to be uniquely human in the current scientific literature. Researchers do not present that as proof that another species could never show it. They present it as the best description of the evidence so far. Visible tears also join human crying early. Reviews place their appearance in infants at roughly 4 to 8 weeks after birth. Even at that stage, the tear adds a visible channel to a behavior that an observer can already hear. Why did that display evolve? Leading proposals treat tears as a signal that can solicit care or strengthen social connection. Those are hypotheses, not a recovered historical recording. What experiments can show is narrower. Tears change how observers read a face, and they can increase stated intentions to offer support. What remains unknown? Quite a lot. Scientists have mapped the gland, its nerves, the drainage route, many facial muscles, and parts of the vocal control network. They know central autonomic input can reach the TIR pathway without ocular sensory input. But reviews still describe the specific human neural circuitry of emotional crying as being in its infancy. The sources reviewed here do not identify one brain region that explains the entire behavior. That uncertainty makes crying more interesting, not less. The event is a convergence point. Separation, loss, a wedding, or a piece of music can be translated into autonomic signals. Those signals recruit glands, ducts, facial muscles, breathing, and voice. Fluid crosses the edge of the eyelid, and someone else can read that internal change from across a room. Your body has turned emotion into a public physiological signal. When you think about a cry you remember clearly, did the relief come from the tears themselves, or from what happened after someone noticed them? Tell us in the comments. Next time, we will map what happens during brain freeze.